Okay, so yeah, everything is being interpreted in terms of sectionalism, and so I want to read the Second Great Awakening and its outcome or its implications in that same way. The Second Great Awakening is a religious movement, very much like the first. But if you remember, the way we talked about the Second Great Awakening was yes, it's important religiously, but it's actually more important in many ways socially and politically. Some historians argue that the First Great Awakening created a leadership group that becomes the revolutionary leaders. Some argue that it creates these kind of new light leaders. It creates national imagined community and such. In the same way, this Second Great Awakening is going to spill outside the church and into society, right? And they're going to see social changes as a result. And I think that's really what makes it so significant in a way is that ordinary people are going to decide they can change their society for the better. Ordinary people, as they often do from time to time in our history, look around at their society and identify certain problems and decide that they don't need to wait for somebody else to fix those problems. They can do it themselves. So in a way, this is people being empowered, right? You don't have to wait for the president to pass a law to kind of, clean up your neighborhood, right? Because that may never happen. That may never come. You can take matters into your own hands in a positive way. So in many ways, the Second Great Awakening is similar. It really begins in the early 1800s, but it's going to last and really come to fruition, you can argue, in this period, the antebellum era. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. So think about how you might hear a sermon in church, and then when Sunday morning is over, what are you going to do with it? Right? So many decide that they have to implement what they've been learning. Right? They have to implement what they've been learning in their society. So this kind of revivalism will lead to calls for social changes, social reforms of various types, and various reform movements will be born of this era. And we'll talk about a couple of key ones that are listed here. In particular, it's going to take hold in New England. So many of these reforms seem regional, seem sectional, especially if you're in the South. You feel like, man, those Northerners are up to crazy stuff all the time, right? They're different than us down here, and vice versa. Northerners are looking at Southerners and making the case that they're backward or they're uncivilized, right? So I think they're already seeing themselves as two separate nations, which is something you have to imagine if you're going to go to war with someone, right? You have to imagine them as different than yourself. So think about how this revivalism leads to calls for change or reform. As new congregations grow, right, when people are religious and they feel like they're not living the way God wants, this causes a crisis. Right? If you feel like you're going to hell, you may want to do something different. And so you see a whole bunch of people that will begin to do that and begin to try to make change for the better. So benevolent societies grow out of churches, and people spill out of church and try to put their fingerprint on their communities and their societies. Many evangelical leaders will look at certain problems in society and say, okay, let's focus on this. So for example, some evangelical leaders would focus on the problem of, or the practice of dueling, right? Dueling. When we talked about Andrew Jackson, we talked about how Andrew Jackson had busted a cap in somebody, right? When he felt like his wife was insulted, he calls the guy out and it's like, look, pistols at 30 paces. He takes a bullet, he kills the guy. Some people are like, that's a problem. Right? Then maybe there are better ways to kind of solve our issues, and maybe violence isn't the answer. And so some of these folks are like, we need to stop the practice of dueling, even though at the time, and this is one of the things that you could argue makes Jackson a hero to many, right? It's like the Tupac of his time, took a bullet and keep going, right? So it's interesting that you're going to see a shift, like, okay, let's deal with this. So dueling is one thing. Gambling. Some people are like, man, these folks are gambling all their paychecks away and their families are struggling. We need to deal with gambling. We're still dealing with the problem of gambling, right? And deciding how much or how little it should be allowed. Some look at prostitution, right? The oldest profession, as it's labeled, and say this is where we need to make social changes. But the fight against drunkenness really takes hold, right? The fight against too much drinking. We were very much an alcoholic republic. To quote the title of a book by Malcolm Rohrer, I believe is the author of it. We drank a lot back then, right? And some are going to start to see this as problematic. So in many ways, the temperance movement is going to achieve tremendous notoriety, maybe among the greatest of the movements. Since the American Revolution, whiskey was the most popular beverage in the country. There's a beautiful peanut butter whiskey in San Diego that they make. Well, I don't know. But anyway, to drink too much of it can be problematic. Why is it the most popular beverage? Well, as one book says, quote, it was cheaper than milk, so cheaper than milk and safer than water. Right? Water at the time was often polluted. You knew when you got that Jack Daniels, right? It burned out whatever germs were trying to live in it. So people, are drinking that. Um, but think about some of the ways that this might become problematic. If you're drinking before work, or if you're drinking at work, some factory owners would have a keg of beer on the factory floor. He wants to transport back in time. But imagine being around heavy machinery, right? You got a keg all day. Hey, fill me up, right? This could be a problem. Why would they do that? Well, some factory owners knew that their workers were so poor generally that they weren't getting enough calories. So pump them full of carbs. They can get through the workday. But again, think about around closing time, heavy machinery, alcohol doesn't mix. Right? So you can think about why this might be problematic. Or some other reasons why this becomes problematic. Let me give you a hint as to why. The temperance movement becomes about 80% women-centered. Women involved in the temperance movement, women running it. I think this is significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, women can't vote yet. So the thought is women are not political, but that's not true. If they're going to be involved in these movements and change laws and influence politicians, they are political. They just don't have the right to vote quite yet. But think about how this may politicize them in a way. But why do you think that might be the case? Why do you think that temperance or too much drinking might be seen particularly as a woman's problem, woman's issue that women want to get involved in change?
Just get drunk and go home and beat their wives.
Exactly. Direct correlation between domestic abuse and too much drinking. So a lot of women are like, this is a women's issue, it's a family issue, it's a national issue. If you can fix these men, you'll fix the family and therefore fix the nation. They might feel like they're doing their patriotic duty in addition to taking care of themselves. Plus, at the local tavern, men often cash their paycheck after work. So you get your paycheck on Friday, you're walking home, your house is there. Hey, honey, tell you what, I'm going to dip in here real quick and have a couple Samuel Adams. Hey, buddy, can you cash this? I tell you what, hold on to it for a minute. I'm going to have a couple drinks. A few hours later. Okay, can I get my check back and get my change? Sorry, you spent it all. Ooh. Now you go home penniless. So economically, this could be a problem. Socially, in terms of violence, all these issues could emerge, and women will take the lead in trying to deal with this issue of temperance. In this antebellum period, now we do know that this eventually sprouts into a huge movement. Frances Willard in the 1870s will be one of the leaders of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. She's going to have the ear of hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Even though she can't vote, she's considered one of the most powerful women of the 19th century. Politicians come to town, they had to go talk to Frances Willard, see what she wanted to have, because she has a lot of influence and power. And we know that temperance eventually, around after World War I, becomes prohibition. Right? We do decide to change the Constitution temporarily and outlaw alcohol. Now there are going to be some side effects of that as well, right? Al Capone, gangsters, bootlegging, NASCAR. People start souping up cars to be able to outrun law enforcement with this illegal alcohol, and we get NASCAR out of that. So we get a lot of things out of this. But think about it's a real cool special on History Channel about it. I was like, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know this stuff. So think about the kind of intended and unintended consequences of movements like this, but also how some of them are going to be seen then as northern movements or southern movements, or they're really attempting to unite the nation, but they might do just as much to split the nation in the minds of some. Either way, it seems to work. The temperance movement will be divided between those that wanted to ban alcohol altogether and those that wanted to just cut it down, maybe especially hard liquor, and maybe drink less. On average, we drank 7 gallons of whiskey per capita per person at the time, way more than now. Yeah. Yeah, way more, 2 or 3 times what we drink today. Either way, it seems to work. By the 1830s, alcohol consumption in the U.S. had been cut significantly reduced. So these women see the fruits of their labor, you can argue. Now, another outgrowth of this reform era is going to be abolition, the abolitionist movement. Again, it seems like a lot of these topics keep bringing us back to the subject of slavery. So think about how abolition in particular is going to take on a kind of regional cast as well. Right? Abolition is going to be one of these really important movements. Many evangelical leaders, primarily in the North, will put forth moral and religious objections to slavery. Right? A lot of folks read the Bible and they're like, man, Jesus wouldn't like this. Right? And others will object for other reasons. Now, abolitionists are a complicated group. They're kind of a complicated imagined community in and of themselves because people might be abolitionists for a variety of reasons. And overall, though the statement may sound counterintuitive at first, most abolitionists might still be racist. Why would they want to get rid of slavery? Well, people might be abolitionists for a variety of reasons. If you were a factory owner in Massachusetts, right, and you have 1,000 employees to pay, you're like, man, I can't compete with somebody that doesn't pay their labor. Let's get rid of the slavery thing, economic competition. Some think it's a sin, but aren't necessarily ready for the whole racial equality thing. There might be a number of reasons why folks are abolitionists. Most abolitionists at the time were gradualists. They thought, okay, maybe we'll eventually get rid of the slavery thing, but we have to do it over time. New York abolishes it over several decades. When you get to 25, you're free. So it's really like not until the 1820s or so that most of the northern states have completely gotten rid of slavery. But there are going to be a new crop of abolitionists that are like, no, this is ridiculous. We need immediate, unconditional abolition. Some abolitionists are like, okay, we should end slavery, but that means the government's going to have to pay slave owners for their slaves because slaves are property. We value property. But then someone like a William Lloyd Garrison is like, no. If the DEA kicks in the door, takes 10 packs of cocaine, they're not going to write you a check before they leave. Right? They go, sorry, we had to do that. This is for the door, and this is for the cocaine. We like, what, 13,000? 130,000. Here you go. Sorry about that. No, because it's seen as outside of the bounds. But slavery was legal. Was legal property. So how do we sort of manage these moral qualms, these sort of political issues? People are kind of figuring some of this out. So most of the early abolitionists were gradualists, you could call them, and most proposed sending free blacks outside of the country. The idea was that if you did free them, then they would have to go someplace else because even most of them didn't believe this could be a multiracial nation. And even Lincoln was like, I don't think that's going to happen. There's one term I think I forgot to put up here. The ACS, the American Colonization Society. The ACS is an organization in favor of colonization or emigration of free blacks outside the country. So immigration with an E is people leaving the country. Immigration with the I is people coming. So the idea is, okay, if you free these folks, send them someplace else. And the free blacks that are already here, because there are already 500,000 free blacks, 1860, that they need to be sent somewhere else too. They're problematic in a way. So this ACS kind of picks up that. In 1821, the American Colonization Society, which had among its membership a number of U.S. presidents, a very powerful organization. In 1821, they established the colony of Liberia in West Africa in order to send free slaves and free blacks. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after President James Monroe. The 20th Monroe Doctrine, all of that, same guy. So this is going to be an important idea. There are a few African Americans that are like, let's go. Some believe that they'll never be treated equally in the U.S. and they decide to leave and actually do go. Most are like, nah, I'm not going anywhere. And most are like, I've been here for 8, 9, 10 generations working for free. I'm not leaving now. Frederick Douglass and others will be against the idea of immigration. But think about how this issue is going to be a divisive one in many cases. Bless you. So several thousand African Americans are going to be settled there, but most reject this idea of returning to the African continent since they weren't born there. By the early 1830s, the abolitionist movement is going to split between those that continue to call for gradual emancipation and removal of blacks to Africa, and those that wanted immediate and unconditional abolition. William Lloyd Garrison is an important figure in this. I think he's significant on several levels because he's so radical. And he's a white guy. William Lloyd Garrison is a white abolitionist from Boston who was among the most radical abolitionists, along with David Walker and others that you would see. Garrison does things like burn copies of the Constitution publicly because he said it was a deal made with the devil because it allowed slavery. He was for immediate and unconditional, uncompensated abolition, says in slavery today. In fact, ended yesterday. Right? This is going to make him incredibly radical for the time. A leader of the so-called radicals, again, is Garrison, who starts publishing his newspaper, the Liberator magazine, in 1831. He starts publishing the Liberator. So right around this time, there are going to be several militant abolitionists. David Walker is another one, free black, who publishes his appeal in 1829. David Walker's appeal, again, this kind of comes up in the essay, is his prediction of the Civil War, essentially. David Walker says, look, if you don't end slavery, it's going to lead to whites killing other whites. He says that in 1829. What happens in 1861? Civil War begins, North and South. David Walker calls for the slaves themselves to rise up and kill their masters if necessary. He says that the U.S. is a land of hypocrites because they claim to be Christian but aren't living like Christians. He quotes from the Bible, he quotes from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. He quotes Thomas Jefferson, specifically calls out Thomas Jefferson on several occasions. So you're getting this more radical, militant voice by this period, and we've seen how folks are going to respond to that. Think about how the creation of these stereotypes coincides with this more militant abolitionist movement. It's not coincidental, as we've seen. Frederick Douglass, right? When Frederick Douglass runs away, he writes his famous narrative. He becomes the speaker. He goes to Boston, hooks up with Garrison for a while. So this abolitionist movement is important. It's going to further separate the regions. And another reason why it's significant, again, is the role of women. A lot of women find themselves drawn to the anti-slavery movement, speaking out against slavery, speaking for abolition. And Garrison is one that says, we welcome women. And in fact, he allows women leadership positions in his organization, which makes him incredibly radical for the time. It was actually considered almost pornographic for a woman to speak publicly before a mixed audience. And a mixed audience was an audience of men and women, right? Mariah Stewart was one of the first to actually speak to mixed audiences. So Garrison's like, we need to break down all of these kind of discriminatory laws, and even many within his own organization are like, no, we don't know about the women thing. It actually will lead to a split in the abolitionist movement, and the American Anti-Slavery Society is going to be one that he and his followers formed. He attracted more free blacks and women than others. But think about women participating in such a movement. Think about how this process might be a very political one on several levels. These women come in, women like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They come in and they're making speeches. Man, slavery is horrible. People are denied. They're treated as property. They can't own property in their own names, and they can't vote. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton's like, wait a second, I can't vote. If I get married, I can't really hold on to my property. Think about how this will have a politicizing effect on the women that are involved in it. Many of these women in the abolitionist movement in the 1830s become the leaders of the women's suffrage movement and the feminist struggles in the 1840s, including Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others. So they're going to start to say, well, wait a second, maybe we need the right to vote to make our society better, including things like abolition. And they will start to push for that specifically. In 1848, supporters of equality and women's suffrage will meet at Seneca Falls, New York. And this is going to be the Seneca Falls Convention. They will produce a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments is patterned on the Declaration of Independence, but these women will point out that the whole phrase, all men are created equal, might be problematic because it might, by definition, leave out half the population. So they're going to push it even further. This is going to set the agenda for the women's rights movement for the next 100 years. So think about the politics in this period and how it's going to lead and really take us beyond the Civil War in many cases. Now, there are other reforms as well that become significant in this era, other institutional reforms. The development of the asylum, for instance, to treat mental illness. Before, if you had mental illness, hopefully you had some family to rely on. Otherwise, you were just kind of turned out of doors. Right? So some say this is problematic. This is not how we should deal with such an issue, and they want to develop something better. With some positive and some obviously some negative aspects to an asylum. Same thing for prisons. Prisons and poorhouses will be born and revolutionized in this period. You really kind of see the birth of the modern prison and modern police forces and such in this era. And the poorhouse is developed as kind of an alternative to the debtor's prison. Remember, we saw these debtor's prisons going back to Shays Rebellion. Right? You get locked up, basically. But how are you going to pay off your debt if you're locked up? So the poorhouse was supposed to teach like a work ethic, right? And then kind of rehabilitate you and send you back out. And the modern prison is supposed to do the same thing, right? Not just punish you and throw you away, but try to help you and rehabilitate you and reintroduce you to the imagined community. So that at least is the idea. Some say that one of the more important reforms is going to be around education. Right? Education, including educational reformers like a Horace Mann. Education is going through changes in this period. People, I think, are rethinking the role of education. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. In 1837, Horace Mann persuaded the Massachusetts legislature to support primary schools, right? So public primary schools. So the Massachusetts legislature is going to support schools. Think about government's involvement in private schools. So Horace Mann and other reformers believe education should be used as a means to teach discipline and respect for order to children in order to transform them into law-abiding citizens. Whereas colonial New Englanders saw education as a means to bringing people closer to God, right? Learning to read the Bible and such, teaching them how to read the scriptures. But Horace Mann and others now viewed education as a way of instilling middle-class values. Right? So the American dream itself is really kind of becoming a middle-class dream in a way. And it's also supposed to teach patriotism. What's the first thing you learn in school? Pledge of allegiance. The idea that you have to have an educated citizenry in the republic, and also that you be taught patriotism, right, from a very young age. There's debates around whether we still do that or not. My son, when he started kindergarten, they did, and then the next year they didn't do it. That's interesting. Horace Mann's common school movement is going to spread throughout New England and through the mid-Atlantic states a little bit more slowly, and very slowly through the South. In fact, most public high schools don't exist in the South until after the Civil War. There's going to be kind of a lag there in terms of educational attainment. Oh, it'd definitely be segregated. At this point, we still have slavery, but even afterwards, yeah, and that might be part of it. Some argue that there's more of an emphasis on keeping those lines in place, which may hinder the society overall. That's another reason why some argue that abolition was good, because it hampered the society's development, and that the society itself, or the South itself, was kind of backward, right, because of that. That's a good point. So we want to get specifically on this road and think specifically about what's been happening, how we get to the point where folks are ready to shoot at each other. Right? How do we get to that point? A lot of it has to do with the role of cotton and the development of politics in this period. A lot of it has to do with the influence of ideas of manifest destiny that we've discussed, and the idea that we're going to reach the Pacific, but then what happens with all this land? How does it look? How do we imagine it? The cotton gin changes the game, right? 1793, it's patented, and by the early 1800s, you definitely can feel the effects economically already. By 1811, Georgia and South Carolina are producing 60 million pounds of cotton a year. Georgia and South Carolina, 60 million pounds a year. Most of it is being shipped to England, which then helps with England's own industrialization, right? Their textile mills. So the U.S. South is going to be supplying the world, as we've seen. Other areas will grow, and you get this migration south and west, as we've already kind of seen. Populations increase tremendously, especially after the War of 1812, when the soil is exhausted. We've talked about the issue of soil exhaustion, so many people necessarily move south and west in this period. For example, between 1810 and 1820, Mississippi's population more than doubles. Right, in a decade, the state population more than doubles. Alabama's population grows more than 16 times over. So basically, huge population growth. Why folks are migrating and moving, especially to follow these cotton profits, and especially as land is accessed. Nearly 50% of all white South Carolinians born after 1800 eventually left South Carolina and went west. And so half the state moves. And this is tremendous movement if you think about it from that perspective. The West is really important to both the North and the South. Now, of course, Native American populations are really paying the price for this expansion. I think about the Trail of Tears and the difficulties we have discussed. There's going to be a hunger for land, but their natives are an obstacle to that because they're on the land. It's theirs. So they are going to be removed and or destroyed. We've seen this process of arguing about the slave trade itself. There actually will be proposals to reopen the Atlantic slave trade on several occasions, but they decided not to do it, in part because they really didn't have to. Right? There were enough people smuggling. I think Amistad. Right? There were enough people bringing folks in illegally. Plus, and just as importantly, maybe more importantly, there's something called the domestic slave trade. The domestic slave trade really picks up after the Atlantic slave trade is outlawed. Atlantic slave trade was being able to bring in more slaves from outside the U.S. That's over, supposedly in 1808. But does that mean slavery ends? No. Slavery gets bigger. So where are you going to get the labor from? Well, you get it from who's already here. Right? People moving from the upper South to the lower South, being sold down the river, quote unquote, and also from reproduction, trying to push a natural reproduction. U.S. society is the only slave society where slaves, quote unquote, naturally reproduce themselves. But I put that in quotes for reasons we've discussed. Think about how the laws were set up to reproduce this population, particularly things like the law of matrilineal descent. Right? If an owner rapes his slave and a child is produced, he's just made himself some money. Right? So this is not natural in that sense. Plus, many owners would push slave breeding. They would put two slaves together that they thought would have a healthy baby and kind of say, look, if you're not having a child in a year, I'll sell you. That happens on occasion as well. It happens a lot as well. So it's not always natural, but this is the only society where more slaves are born than have to be brought in. Right? That is significant in and of itself. And the population will increase. Think about how all this is going to then fuel those pro-slavery arguments that we saw in the form of the stereotypes, right? Pro-slavery arguments will develop really to defend the institution and to defend the South from what they felt like were attacks. Right? So slaves are happy. This is their natural place. This is the natural order of things. It's good for the economy. It's in the Bible. All these arguments might be used, of course, to justify what we were already sort of doing. Even as resistance constantly increases, there's constant resistance of everyday forms as well as an increase in outright revolts. There are three major revolts in the early part of this period. 1800, Gabriel Prosser attempts a revolt. 1820, Denmark Vesey attempts a revolt. Both of them were found out right before they happened. Slaves told on them, basically. And they get found out. But 1831, Nat Turner. Nat Turner actually does execute a revolt. About 60 white Southerners were killed before Turner and his followers were captured and executed. So this freaks people out. Right? Imagine the South in 1831, like, man, all those arguments are causing slaves to revolt. We got to do something. They already, in a sense, feel like they're at war. So think about the power of these arguments that we've seen before. So we've seen a lot of changes, right? Between 1800 and 1850, we see tremendous changes in this nation. Tremendous changes. Just in terms of population, we see some changes. For example, in 1800, or between 1800 and 1850, let me put it this way, the nation triples in size. Triples in size. There are 16 states in 1800. There are 31 states in 1850. The population increases tremendously between 1800 and 1850. There are about 5.3 million people in 1800. There are 23 million in 1850. So we're growing rapidly. With growth come challenges. So the 1850s is really, we're setting the stage for something, I think, and we can look particularly at this period and explore it. America is much wealthier in 1850 than it was in 1800. Southern cotton is hugely important, but it's not the only factor. Western lands, which also reinforce things, railroads, industrialism, all of this is aiding into our economic growth. Social life is developing in the U.S. We're developing our own heroes and icons and artists and writers. Remember, we have traditionally looked to England, right, and looked up to England and their culture, but we start to develop people whose names we still know. Think about it, Henry David Thoreau, writing in the 1850s, or Emily Dickinson, or Walt Whitman, Herman Melville. Frederick Douglass, in his classic narrative, is still an American classic, even though it's obviously about slavery. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I want to talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, specifically. One, because it relates to the ethnic notion, but two, because the politics of it are really, really important, and they illustrate some of the things we've been talking. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes her book in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, which we'll get to in a second. It's a protest against the Fugitive Slave Act, but it's fictionalized based on an actual narrative. But it tips. Uncle Tom's Cabin tips. She writes this book in 1852. It sells 300,000 copies the first year and 2 to 3 million copies within a decade. By the time the Civil War starts, her book is sold between 2 and 3 million copies. When Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, he says, "I want to meet the woman that started the war." He felt like it was that significant in terms of kind of galvanizing anti-slavery opinion and enraging Southerners, right, who felt like this was kind of a slander of them in the region generally. But it really kind of continued a process that had already begun, right? We're seeing this sectionalism, we're seeing this separation of the two regions here. A lot of it had to do with politics and separate political parties. Some of it even had to do with religion itself. You see a split in certain religious denominations into northern and southern branches in this period. Right, the Presbyterians split in 1837, the Methodists split in 1844, and the Baptists split in 1845, right, largely around these north-south issues, quite often about issues like slavery. John C. Calhoun and others are arguing for states' rights. Others say the Union itself must take precedence. So we have a lot of issues that are playing out, and they're coming to a head as we moved into the 1840s and 1850s. And we've kind of seen some of this. Some of it is becoming so difficult that it seems like it may lead to violence. Southerners are speaking about these abolitionist instigators, that they're riling up slaves, that they're attempting to invade the South and take away that tradition and culture there. Northerners speak of Southern censorship and backwardness and uncivilization. There would be a gag rule even, right? This gag rule is placed saying that you can't even talk about it because it's so divisive. In Congress, there are congressmen that beat other congressmen unconscious, as you've seen. Preston Brooks from South Carolina beats the Massachusetts congressman over the head, knocks him out in Congress. People are coming to Congress with guns and pistols and knives. So it seems, by the 1850s that something is brewing, and people are afraid that it might be the beginning of the end. As we've seen, this is going to kind of culminate with Lincoln, right? And Lincoln in his election in 1860. But the 1850s themselves are really a important moment, and so I want to kind of just finish quickly with a couple of the specifics from the 1850s that get us to Lincoln and his election. Lincoln is going to kind of be the tipping point, as we've seen, right? The South starts to feel like, okay, all is lost. We've lost everything, and so secession is the only way out. But there were many factors leading up to that. We talked about how race is seen as biological in this era. It's not seen as socially constructed or imagined. It's seen as hardwired. I think the fact that this stuff is seen as so static is part of the issue. That spilled over, as we saw last time, into anti-immigrant feelings. I told you about the American Party briefly. The American Party was formed in 1853. They're better known as the Know Nothings. They were all about stopping immigration. But what's interesting is not only were they anti-immigrant, but they also viewed the extension of slavery as a threat to free white workers. So they didn't want any immigrants coming in, but they also didn't want slavery to spread from where it was because they thought this was a threat to free white workers. So it's really going to be interesting, some of the political coalitions that are founded in this period, as we will see. This sectional crisis comes to a head in the 1840s and 1850s. Right, it comes to a head. Leading up to the Civil War, tension is in the air. Right? It's starting to seem more and more inevitable. Think about the Mexican-American War and how that solves some problems, perhaps, but opens up some more. Maybe opens up a can of worms. The U.S. will win a vast territory as a result of this war, as we saw. Right? But what's this territory going to look like? Is the immediate question. And even during the war, this comes up. Even before the war is over, this issue comes up. For example, before the war was over, the question of slavery and freedom is brought up in Congress itself. In 1846, David Wilmot, a congressman from Pennsylvania, writes his proviso, his plan for what we should do with the land that we know we're going to win. Right? Manifest destiny. We already know we're going to win it. So what are we going to do with this territory that we're going to get from Mexico? Well, Wilmot writes in this legislation that he's proposing in Congress that we should prohibit slavery in any of the territories that might be acquired from Mexico. So he's like, look, we haven't done anything yet, but when we get it, we need to make sure there's no slavery there. People lose their minds. Right? Southerners are like, look, these Northerners, again, are trying to limit our expansion. They're trying to take our American dream. They're challenging our traditions. Right? And Northerners are like, look, these Southerners want to take over. They want everything. So even in 1846, this becomes an issue. So although the Wilmot Proviso was ultimately rejected, it was a signal to many that this was going to be an issue from here on out. Right? It was going to be an issue. It sort of showed how deeply divided folks already were. In the next election in 1848, then, this becomes an issue. Right? These divisions will surface specifically in the election of 1848. The Democrats in 1848 nominated a guy named Lewis Cass, C-A-S-S. He's from Michigan, and the fact that we don't remember his name so much probably means he didn't. But he's important for several reasons. Lewis Cass argues for something called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. Cass comes up with this idea that, okay, I know how to solve the problem. We will let the people decide whether they want to be a slave or a free state. We'll let the people decide. You can't go wrong that way, right? Democracy in action. So rather than have some law go in place, just let the people figure it out. So popular sovereignty is kind of coined, I guess, at this point. So this was the idea, popular sovereignty. This was the idea that the people within each territory should decide whether or not to permit slavery. The Whig Party that had emerged during Andrew Jackson's time nominated a hero of the Mexican-American War by the name of Zachary Taylor for president. So he's going to run against Lewis Cass. The Whigs, their strategy was to avoid the slavery issue. They know how divisive an issue it is, and they want to instead focus on Zachary Taylor's record as a war hero. So if you can do that, avoid the slavery thing, maybe you can win. But the fact that Taylor was a Southerner, he's from Louisiana, and a large plantation owner, disturbed many abolitionists within the Whig Party. So even though they're trying to avoid the issue, they cannot avoid the issue. So much so that half the party, labeling themselves conscience Whigs, decide to leave the party. They say, no, we can't be a part of this. They leave, they form a new political party called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party. I thought I had these terms somewhere. So the Free Soil Party is formed out of these conscience Whigs, right, that have decided to leave. Is there? I don't have my glasses off. So think about this notion of free soil. It's the idea that you have free territory, right, that you won't allow slavery there. Now these free soilers will nominate the former president, Martin Van Buren, as their president. Right? They figure they could get a guy that had been president before, and this will allow them to win. And Van Buren, of course, is a New Yorker. So it still has this kind of north-south feel to it. Right? Van Buren had succeeded Andrew Jackson in 1837, but he only had served one term. Well, Van Buren's candidacy, his third-party candidacy, splits the vote. It kind of messes everything up. It splits the Democrats, so it allows Taylor to be elected president. So Zachary Taylor wins in 1848. Again, it sort of shows how the slavery issue already seems to be deciding elections, in fact. And it shows that this free soil movement is gaining power, gaining momentum. So how is Zachary Taylor going to do? He's walking into office in the midst of all this kind of confusion, all this tension. What is he going to do to sort of resolve these issues, if anything? Remember, we get all this territory as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Gold is discovered in 1848, which leads to massive migration out west. That means that our fair state, California, comes up for statehood pretty quickly. Right? We reach the population numbers. We apply for statehood in 1850, and this is going to raise an issue. California's white majority opposed slavery. Why? Because we're great people, of course. Well, that's part of it. Part of it was because they didn't want a bunch of slaveholders coming in with all these slaves taking all the gold. Right? That's a big part of it, too. Competition. But either way, we apply as a free state. And this is going to cause an issue because remember, that whole Missouri's Compromise line down the middle of the country, everything north of that's supposed to be free. Everything south of it is supposed to be slave. But we know California, that's this right here in my perfect map. Well, what are you going to do? Cut it in Los Angeles? Slave free? No. This is going to cause an issue. This is going to cause an issue in that delicate balance and all these compromises that we've been working out for the previous few decades. California applies, and at the time there were 15 free states and 15 slave states. 15 free states and 15 slave states, meaning equal representation in the Senate. And actually, the North had a 61 vote majority in the House, because remember how that's set up based on population. So this could throw a monkey wrench into things and kind of tip the delicate balance that seemed to be in play. Well, what's Taylor going to do? Taylor's a Southerner. Right? So some think he's going to go along with the South on this. He's a Southerner, he's a supporter of slavery, but he's also a supporter of expansion. He wants to reach the Pacific like many others at this point. So he wants to get California in. Taylor comes out in favor of the principle of popular sovereignty. Right? Let the people decide. In Utah and New Mexico that are coming up for admission as well. California will be admitted as a free state, and these other territories can vote for themselves. Right? That's how he'll work his way around that. Even though those people in Utah and New Mexico were likely to vote against slavery, and he was the Southerner. So he's kind of walking on eggshells in a sense. Right? He's trying to navigate these difficult positions. Many Southerners resisted California's admission. They were haters. They didn't want us coming in. But essentially it was a political question, right? So there's a deadlock, right? We can't get it figured out. What do? Compromise. The 1850 compromise will be crafted out of this. So Henry Clay, one of the architects of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, is going to propose a solution, and this will become the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 will admit California as a free state, and it's going to allow popular sovereignty or voting in New Mexico and Utah. But what do Southerners get for all this given into the North? Well, they get a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. So in 1850, as you heard in the video, this stronger Fugitive Slave Act is put in place. Right? It reinforces their rights to seize and return to slavery those that had fled into free territories or states. So in the past, Southerners or slaves in the South would run to the North because that's free territory. But this says you can go into the North and retrieve your slave property. Not only does this Fugitive Slave Act say that, but it also says that you can go north and call out the local constables to help you get your slave property back. You can deputize whoever's around. So imagine a slave runs away to Boston, Massachusetts, and knocks on William Lloyd Garrison's house. Garrison's like, come in, I got you, right? I got your back, don't worry about it. Some slave traders come and say, hey, it's our slave in there, give him back. We're deputizing you. Garrison is like, are you crazy? Don't you know who I am? I burn constitutions, man. They're like, the law says you got to give him back. We'll call out the local law enforcement or even the army. This actually happens. In 1854, there's a guy named Anthony Burns. Runs away, finds his way to Boston and some abolitionists. They say, "We'll protect you with our lives," and they meant it. People come try to recapture him. There's a shootout. Several folks get shot. They call out the army. They called out the army, an army regiment, and a navy ship to take this one slave back to the South. An entire regiment and a ship to take one slave. Imagine how expensive that is. But also imagine how kind of telling this is in terms of the politics of it. So this is what Harriet Beecher Stowe was writing in response to this Fugitive Slave Act, which Northerners felt like made them slave traders. Even an abolitionist then may have to be a slave trader according to this law. So this is putting a Band-Aid on the problem, but it's not solving the issue, right? These compromises are getting things done, but they're not solving the issue as we've seen. In reality, few people are satisfied with the compromise. Southerners feel like they've given up the entire West. Northerners feel like they've given up too much in terms of this Fugitive Slave Act. You also had the outlawing of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. as a part of the 1850 compromise. There was slave trading in the nation's capital up till 1850 in this compromise as well, which is important. Northern anti-slavery forces kick it up another notch, and we start to see even more activity on the Underground Railroad. You know, the Underground Railroad is not an actual train, right? It was conductors or people that would establish safe houses to help slaves run away. So you might run away at night, and then when the sun was coming up, you'd find a friendly house to stop at, right? People had like trap doors in their house and a hole in the floor, right, where they could hide slaves for the day just in case somebody came looking, and then kind of send them on to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. So Southerners are like, look, these white Northerners are helping our property escape. They're stealing from us. Southerners and Northerners are feeling like we're enemies. And so all of this is leading to an increase in tensions, an increase in sectionalism, as we've seen. All of it happening now, especially that we're in the 1850s. Again, we've seen significance of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this only increases the tensions, right? It only increases the tensions. Kansas and Nebraska, right? The Kansas and Nebraska territories now come up. Despite hardening positions on both sides, many are convinced that popular sovereignty is the way out. Just let the people decide that nobody can be bad. But that's not going to work, of course. The next great test of that will be Kansas and Nebraska, these territories that are applying for statehood. By the late 1840s, enough settlers had moved into the area for it to be organized into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. But because these territories were north of the Missouri Compromise line, they're supposed to be closed to slavery. Well, what if the people vote for slavery? Many Southerners, though, wanted to open Kansas and Nebraska to slavery given their losses elsewhere. So there are problems brewing. Right? There are problems brewing. So let the people vote. Popular sovereignty. Well, what happens in this case is, since they know there's going to be a vote, thousands of abolitionists flock into Kansas. Thousands of pro-slavery forces flock into Kansas. They feel like if they can get their population up, they can outvote the other side. In fact, as you heard, they actually will form two separate governments, right? Two separate constitutions in the state. What they call is squatter sovereignty. Squatter sovereignty, because you're squatting, you're there, right? Your numbers. But it's really going to lead to what we call bleeding Kansas. There's violence in Kansas, including John Brown, who you saw, another radical white abolitionist who actually kills some folks, kills some pro-slavery men in Kansas and his sons. So this is bleeding Kansas. Some argue that we're already in civil war. People are dying over the slavery issue. So maybe this is already civil war. We just haven't declared it yet. A coalition of free soilers and abolitionists that had opposed the Kansas and Nebraska Act would form a new political party. You heard this here, but that new political party are called the Republicans. Right, they're formed in 1856. They're joined by other former members of the American or the Know Nothing Party. Remember those anti-immigrant American Party that also opposed the extension of slavery? Right, they joined them as well because they believed all of these things threatened free whites. The Republicans will nominate their first candidate ever, John C. Fremont of California, in 1856. And he does well in 1856, but he does not win. But their second candidate is going to be Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So they do well fast. are on the rise. James Buchanan, though, will win in 1856. He's a Democrat. But his candidacy, his presidency, is going to make things worse, according to most. He hoped to avoid the political consequences of taking a stand on slavery at all, and he thinks he can kind of have other people deal with it, including the Supreme Court. Right? So this issue comes up in the Dred Scott case of 1857. It's going to be a Supreme Court case. Basically, the story with Dred Scott is this. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri, but his master takes him to the north. He's going to live in the Wisconsin Territory and some other territories for about 10 years. Right? So he takes him in 1846 to free territory. Well, Dred Scott is like, well, wait a second. If I'm in free territory, how can I be a slave? There is no slavery here. So he will sue for his freedom. Right? Him and his wife, Harriet Dred and Harriet Scott, sue for their freedom. He argued that because the Missouri Compromise had prohibited slavery in Wisconsin, he was entitled to emancipation. Their original petition is denied, but the Scots filed an appeal and it ultimately works its way up to the Supreme Court. In 1856, the court was about to dismiss Dred Scott's appeal on technical grounds, but President-elect Buchanan at the time was like, no, why don't you guys deal with that so I don't have to. He's got to pass it down the road. So the resulting decision is going to be the Dred Scott versus Sanford case of 1857. Roger Taney, Supreme Court Justice, arguing that as African Americans, whether slave or free, the Scots could not possibly be citizens of the United States. He says because they're African American, they cannot be citizens. Roger Taney, again a Supreme Court Justice, wrote that no African American, whether slave or free, could ever be considered citizens, since the founding fathers could never have intended such a result. He said the founding fathers didn't want this, so they're not even citizens. And in fact, he argued that they shouldn't even have been allowed to appear in court. Taney ruled that back in 1820, Congress had no authority under the Constitution to even prohibit slavery in the Wisconsin Territory, or to prohibit it anywhere. Slave owners are now fully protected if they chose to bring their slaves into Western territories, Northern territories, anywhere. What you start to see even more of are when slaves run away, they don't stop in the north, right? They go north and go all the way to Canada because they don't feel safe even in the north. Now, many abolitionists decide that this is too much, right? At this point, the time for action has emerged. And John Brown is going to be one of these figures again. We saw in Kansas, John Brown was like, no, this is it. John Brown was a very religious person, and he believed that God talked to him, and God told him to break the jawbone of slaveholders. So he decides to come up with a plan to try to do exactly that. John Brown was from Connecticut initially. He had fought in Bleeding, Kansas, as we saw. And in 1859, he led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His plan was to get the guns at Harper's Ferry and give them to the slaves of Virginia, and let the slaves end slavery, right, through an armed revolt. Kind of like a Shays' Rebellion. Right? Get the guns, and then do what you needed to do with that. He comes up with this plan. He had, I think, 3 of his sons with him, several runaway slaves, several free blacks as well, about 20 people. They're doing okay at first, but they're quickly surrounded by the army. A young, I think it was a colonel at the time by the name of Robert E. Lee, who will later be the leader of the Confederate forces, pins him down, and he's wounded, captured, and John Brown will eventually be executed. But think about how the South looks at this. Man, these white Northerners are literally attacking him. So by 1859, a lot of folks are like, we're at the brink of war. What happens the next year? The election of Abraham Lincoln. As we saw, Lincoln, his election is the final straw. Lincoln had distinguished himself in previous debates, in like the Lincoln-Douglas debates and such, as early as 1858. He argued that the nation could not survive half slave and half free, but he also was, he really was philosophically opposed to slavery, but he's conflicted in certain ways, right? In many ways, he was conflicted. He thought it was immoral, but he also said, I'm not going to end it where it is. I don't want it to spread, but I won't touch it where it exists. Lincoln loses his race in 1858, but he comes back in 1860. And that election has four major candidates. Some Northern Democrats, and you're already seeing the kind of regional breakdown, right? The Democrats, the Republicans, the Constitutional Union Party ran a candidate. They're so divided that Abraham Lincoln does not even bother to campaign in the South. You sort of saw this. He doesn't even appear on the ballot, I think, in 9 southern states. So imagine their surprise when he wins. He only wins 39% of the popular vote. So imagine their surprise when they're told, hey, this guy's the new president. They're like, what are you talking about? He wasn't even on the ballot. He knew he wasn't, it would be a waste of his time to even go south. He's from Illinois. But he won a majority in the Electoral College, and we know that's more important than the popular vote. Given the North's larger population, he is able to win. Lincoln's election signals to the Deep South that they had lost, that it was over. The federal government's no longer going to protect their interests. Lincoln does not start the war. South Carolina will formally secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. They leave the Union December 20th, 1860, even before Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated. They're like, we're out. The other states in the Deep South will follow, but in the Upper South and border states, people still hoped for compromise. Lincoln himself wanted to be patient and decides not to take action, even once South Carolina leaves. And it's not until April 12th, 1861, about a month after he takes office, that South Carolina attacks Fort Sumter. So they essentially start the conflict. Fort Sumter is attacked, they bombard it and force it to surrender, and this prompts Lincoln to officially declare a state of insurrection. And at that point, the states of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas declare their secession, leading to the Civil War. So again, a lot happens in this 1850s, but I felt like we had to at least kind of walk through that to kind of get us to the point, right? Think about the long-term factors and also the kind of tipping points that we've seen here as we try to figure out how our story comes to an end.